My name is GJ Melendez-Torres. I'm Professor of Clinical and Social Epidemiology at the University of Exeter, but more importantly, I'm a public health nurse by background, and a lot of my work clinically has been on the health and specifically the public health of children, particularly in school contexts. So as Maria said, I'm going to be talking about some work that we did in partnership with Cardiff University, but also with colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, to really get underneath how, why, where, and in what ways school-based interventions to prevent dating and relationship violence and gender-based violence are effective. Now, there are a few things that we sought to do. One of the things that we sought to do was to really understand how and why we think these interventions work, to get underneath the theory and process of these school-based interventions. The other thing that we sought to do was to evaluate their effectiveness. Do they work? Ultimately, it's not worth doing anything if it doesn't work. But we also were really keen to get underneath the equity impacts of these interventions. And when I talk about equity impacts, what I mean is an understanding of for whom these interventions work better than for others, and the degree to which that differential effectiveness, right, that working better for some groups than for others, helps us to reduce or in fact worsens health inequalities amongst young people. The next thing we wanted to do was to explore heterogeneity in effectiveness. This is a bit of jargon that just means what we wanted to do was figure out why some interventions work better than others. And finally, we wanted to develop a model that helped us to understand why this was, why it was that some interventions worked better than others. So as Maria said, this is the largest review ever undertaken of school-based interventions for dating violence and gender-based violence. And as part of that, we included 247 papers covering 68 randomized trials and analyzed those using a multi-stage process. The reason we did this was fundamentally informed by the conversations that we had with all of you, with teachers and other people who are working really at the coalface of education. We're aware that in England, and especially in Wales, there are new duties relating to how we teach healthy relationships content, mindful that a lot of what makes that content healthy relationships content is in fact the prevention of dating violence. We're also aware that gender-based violence remains present and persistent in schools with impacts that are unequally distributed. The data that we have on whether boys or girls are more affected is a bit equivocal, but we do know consistently that girls experience a greater impact of these forms of violence consistently and over the course of their time in school as well as beyond. So in addition to the fact that schools are facing increasing pressure to teach healthy relationships content, we also know that DRV and GBV are high on policy agendas for both Ofsted and Estin. But schools and school leaders need clearer guidance as to what works, why, and where. And this was really at the crux of why we sought to undertake this work in the first place. So the first thing that we sought to understand was the theory and process of school-based interventions. When I talk about theory and process, what I mean is to understand how we think these interventions work and what it is like to do them in schools. These things are important to understand because if we don't know how they work, then we don't know how to replicate that effectiveness in different contexts. Equally, we also want to know a little bit about what it's like to do these interventions in schools so we can be aware as to what the tripping hazards might be or the stumbling blocks might be, but also the plus points might be of implementing these interventions. So our first set of findings relates to theory and process. And the first thing that we found in terms of intervention theories is that these theories were actually remarkably vague and non-specific. And that was pretty unhelpful. Ooh, I think someone needs to mute themselves. Okay, so these intervention theories were remarkably vague and non-specific. One of the things that we saw was that there was a really strong focus on the benefits of multi-level intervention, which was meant doing stuff in classrooms, doing stuff with teachers, and then doing stuff at the school level. Multi-level interventions or whole school approaches are very popular at the moment, but it remains an open question whether those are the most effective ways to address dating violence and gender-based violence. What we also found was that interventions could be effective by changing students' thoughts and feelings relevant to dating violence and gender-based violence. For example, by changing how acceptable they thought those behaviors were, by changing students' behaviors towards each other, by changing staff capacity to address dating violence and gender-based violence, but also by changing school norms and policies. And thinking over the breadth and multiple levels available to us for intervention is important because it gives us more and different opportunities to do something about these very challenging problems. One of the findings we found that was really surprising to us, but that ended up becoming really salient later on, was the importance of interventions in improving school connectedness and commitment. What underpinned that particular finding is that the more students feel bonded to and engaged with ways of behaving in school or school contexts that are relevant for the provision of that teaching, a provision of dating violence, the more effective it is likely to be in terms of making that intervention more effective in school contexts. Can I just check, can everyone hear me? Everyone can hear me. Okay, great. So the next thing I want to raise is around intervention implementation. Now, the key finding that we had from intervention implementation was this idea that we need to all be in this together. Intervention may be best delivered when they align with school preparedness, which includes a receptive school climate, staff buy-in, and strong school leadership. In addition, interventions that focus on developing relationships between students may be more readily implemented. This is important for two reasons. The first reason it's important is that it suggests that schools need to choose interventions that meet them where they are in terms of their preparedness to do something complex. The second reason this is important is because it suggests that interventions that focus on developing that school commitment, that commitment to these appropriate ways of behaving in school, is an important way to achieve this target of reducing dating violence and gender-based violence. Teachers and students raised a number of features of value, including intervention interactivity, facilitator content knowledge, and availability of external support, ease of delivery, and modification of interventions to suit the particularities of different settings. So when we looked at intervention theories, what we found was this need to consider intervening over multiple levels, from the classroom to the school level. When we looked at intervention implementation, what we found was that there was an important need for everyone to be in it together, for schools to choose interventions that meet them where they are in terms of their preparedness, but also to think about interventions that focus on developing relationships between students as being a real plus point in terms of interventions being well received. So having done some of the underpinning work, understanding how interventions work and what it's like to implement them, we then turned our attention to intervention effectiveness. And of course, at the end of the day, what we want to do is to talk turkey, figure out if it works or not. Our findings relating to dating violence were surprising because what they found was that the way to achieve effectiveness was to anticipate impact over the course of a year. It was unlikely that interventions would generate impacts within the school year. But when we looked at least 1 year post-baseline, for example, measuring beyond one school year, that's when effects started to show up. Looking at dating violence victimization, interventions on average reduced the risk of victimization by 18%. That is a very large impact in public health terms. Similarly, interventions reduced dating violence perpetration in the long term by 22%. Again, that is a gigantic impact in public health terms. So the picture that we're rapidly developing here is that interventions are highly effective from a public health perspective when you start to measure that impact over more than one school year. This takes time and it takes effort, but it's reassuring that even if we don't measure short-term benefits, we are likely to pick those up in the long term. Now, this was disappointing, on the other hand, because when we looked at gender-based violence outcomes, what we found was that interventions weren't as effective. Even when we restricted the sample of analysis to trials undertaken in contexts most similar to England and Wales, what we found was that that reduction in victimization was more like 10 to 15%. Okay? Comparatively speaking, that's not as great of an impact, number one, and number two was a lot more uncertain as well. So this is disappointing because even though we saw some really good results in terms of reducing dating violence, when it came to reducing gender-based violence, we were in a considerably harder position. We then looked at a broader range of outcomes, we would call knowledge and attitudes. Did students know what dating violence and gender-based violence were? And did they feel positive about that, i.e., did they want more? Did they want to reduce that? Did they think that was an acceptable behavior? And did they feel like they could do something about it? That's also known as self-efficacy. What this analysis found was that there were short-term but not long-term impacts on violence acceptance. How okay do you think violence is? And on knowledge of dating violence. There were also short-term added impacts in terms of students' ability to intervene when they saw dating violence or gender-based violence happening in the school context, as well as their own attitudes towards seeking help when they experienced either form of violence. Now, this is interesting because it suggests something very specific about how interventions work on average. What this tells us is that interventions on average begin by generating short-term impacts in terms of students' knowledge, attitudes towards the acceptability of this violence, and ability to do something about it, that then in the long term translate to a broader pattern of cultural norms that are reflected in lower levels of dating violence, victimization, and perpetration as well. It was disappointing that evidence for bystander behaviors was generally rather poor in this evidence base, and we weren't really sure why that was, although one possible reason for this is that we just don't know enough about what that bystander model looks like in secondary school context in terms of preventing dating violence and preventing gender-based violence. So having looked at whether interventions work, we then sought to understand the equity impacts of these interventions. And again, when I talk about equity impacts, what I mean is, do interventions work equally for all groups? Our analysis predominantly focused on two domains. The first was whether interventions are equally effective for boys and for girls, number one. And number two, whether they were more effective for people who reported a prior history of dating violence or of gender-based violence, or those who didn't report a prior history of dating violence or gender-based violence. Now, when you look at these plots, these are called harvest plots. When you look at these harvest plots, what we see for dating violence victimization is there's not really much to say here, okay? Just look at the top bar and the distribution of the bars between greater impact on boys, greater impact on girls, and no gradient. This is broadly suggestive that interventions didn't really have meaningfully differential impacts between boys and girls in terms of reducing dating violence victimization. But when we look at dating violence perpetration, a different picture emerges. When you look at dating violence perpetration, it becomes clear that there is greater evidence that these interventions on average reduce perpetration more in boys than in girls. This is important because even though we know that both boys and girls perpetrate dating violence, there is some epidemiological evidence that suggests that when that violence is perpetrated by boys, it tends to have a greater and more sustained impact. So from an equity perspective, it is positive that we're seeing that these interventions tend to have greater impacts in reducing perpetration in boys. Now, findings for gender-based violence were just a little bit confusing, and we weren't quite sure why this was. It appears that gender-based violence interventions are more effective at reducing victimization in boys than in girls. Now, we think this might be to do with the way that these interventions measure gender-based violence, but we didn't really have a conclusive finding there. And similarly, there was a pattern that suggested that interventions were more effective at reducing perpetration in girls than in boys. So our findings for dating violence were pretty clear that interventions didn't really have a differential impact on victimization, but reduced perpetration more in boys than in girls. Our findings for gender-based violence were somewhat surprising in that they suggested a greater pattern of effects in reducing perpetration in girls and in reducing victimization in boys. Now, the next stage of our analysis sought to explore heterogeneity in effectiveness. Now, again, heterogeneity is just a jargony term for saying, why did some interventions work better than others? One of the benefits of having amassed a data set this large of 68 different trials is that we're able to do these kinds of very high fidelity comparisons between different interventions. Now, what did we do? The first thing we did was we sought to explore whether intervention type explained heterogeneity. Our categorization included 4 different intervention types: single component interventions, one-shot deals; curriculum interventions, interventions that were more likely to be integrated in PSHE or RSE teaching with more than 5 sessions over a sustained period of time; multi-component interventions that went beyond the classroom but didn't necessarily seek to address school policies or school norms; and finally, multi-level strategies, which are whole school strategies, including school environments and structural aspects as well. I just want to be very clear with you that we developed this typology not out of our own minds, but through a long and very sustained process of speaking with teachers and educators like yourselves, who suggested to us that these were the kinds of distinctions that were important in terms of shaping forward implementation decisions. The idea that we often have to make a complicated decision here between interventions that are very relatively straightforward to do in a classroom context versus interventions that are relatively more complex to do and that require working over multiple levels and multiple stages over a long period of time. So the point of this analysis was to really get underneath whether different types of interventions generated different kinds of effectiveness patterns. And, for example, if multi-level interventions were thus more likely to be more effective, for example, than smaller, easier, single component interventions. In short, we didn't really find much of anything. Now, this is that positive finding, I think, in many respects, because it suggests to us, and I think for us the key takeaway from this finding when we've reflected this back to the teachers we were working with, is that interventions that are done well are more likely to be effective. But otherwise, it's more important to do something good than to do something complicated. Now, this was surprising to us because we would expect that more complicated whole school interventions would be more likely to generate effects. And we didn't really see that. In fact, there was some signal that for dating violence in particular, doing a single component intervention, something small, very high quality in a classroom context, would be enough to generate a meaningful and enduring effect on dating violence victimization. So the fact that we were unable to explain heterogeneity, but more to the point that intervention type didn't really explain why some interventions are more effective than others, I think is encouraging. The final step of our analysis was to put all of this together and to think about, okay, let's look at these data from the bottom up instead of from the top down. When we look at these data from the bottom up, what does it tell us about why some interventions are more effective than others? I'm not going to bore you with the statistical details of how we did this, but in short, we used a method known as qualitative comparative analysis. When we looked at interventions that were most effective for victimization, what we found was that the most effective interventions for victimization were either the ones that were most effective at reducing perpetration, or the ones that were that included single gender components, i.e. that included gender responsive programming, or interventions delivered to a samples with a high percentage of girls. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. The first reason that it's important is that it suggests that to reduce victimization, we need to reduce perpetration, but it's not the only way that we can reduce victimization. The other reason this finding is important is because it suggests that we can't take the gender out of victimization-related outcomes. In short, we need to understand how it is that we address dating violence victimization and gender-based violence victimization by being very clear about the ways that those experiences are fundamentally related to gender. Now, again, this is an important finding, but it doesn't tell us everything. Most importantly, it doesn't tell us what the most effective interventions are for perpetration. When we looked at those interventions, what we found was that interventions either needed to be single component, i.e. easy to do well and to a high standard, interventions that had interpersonal components, i.e. that focus on building those positive relationships between students, interventions that incorporated a high level of guided practice of skills, by which I mean that gave students the chance to test out what they were learning, and importantly for gender-based violence as well, interventions that included social structural components. What I mean by social structural components are interventions that sought to address very specifically the contexts within which gender-based violence happens. This can include environmental contexts. We know that many schools have hotspots where a lot of sexual harassment occurs, but that can also be things like school policies and norms. How do schools meaningfully respond to gender-based violence? Now, it is also interesting that this was important for gender-based violence, but not for dating violence. Okay, and that suggests that while we can do something very simple and straightforward and do that to a high standard for dating violence, when we are looking at gender-based violence, we then need to start to take very seriously the need to look at school culture transformation as a central part of reducing gender-based violence in school contexts. So that was about 23 months of analysis that we were all working on full time. Now, when we put that all back together, the question that we really sought to ask teachers when we spoke to them about these findings is, where do we go from here? And there were a few lessons that emerged from the conversations that we had from teachers and expert interventionists about where do we go from here with this pattern of findings. The first is that we need to go back to the future and think about the kinds of evidence that we need to be generating going forward. Interventions did not adequately address the gendered aspects of dating violence and gender-based violence, and were nearly silent on homophobic gender-based violence. And that last finding was a real disappointment for us. We would have expected that the evidence would have been, in the last decade, really caught up with this very salient issue of homophobic and transphobic gender-based violence. But we learned almost nothing about that based on the studies that we included in our review. We also found that schools really face an important choice here. The first choice that schools need to make is whether they want to destabilize harmful practices or establish prosocial behaviors. That is a lot of sociological language for what I think is a very simple choice. Are schools going to focus on making it less possible to engage in gender-based violence or dating violence? Or are they going to focus on making it better, more positive, cooler, for lack of a better term, to behave in positive ways relating to dating violence and gender-based violence? Are we going to go for a ban approach, or are we going to go for a promoting good ways of behavior approach? That's one important choice that we noted that schools faced. The other important choice that schools face is, how do we choose something that meets us where we are? It may be the case that schools that are working in particularly under-resourced contexts need to focus on ensuring the basic safety of students by suppressing harmful behaviors rather than encouraging positive behaviors. But schools that were starting from a more positive baseline with higher levels of resourcing and stronger leadership may in fact have been able to move to that more positive step of, how do we promote positive ways of being around dating violence and gender-based violence as well. Finally, it may be less important to do something complicated than to do something well. Doing something complicated didn't necessarily lead to better effects across the range of our analysis. There was some signal that working on gender-based violence required a more explicitly social structural approach. But for dating violence in particular, there wasn't really evidence that doing something complicated really generated that much value. And finally, as a result of that, schools should make a decision relating to choosing interventions that are easy to implement and that have a very good fit with where they are, their needs and their capacities, as opposed to embarking on a complex change project that might result in not much bang for the buck. So I'll pause there. I just want to acknowledge the research team that undertook this work, and just to say thank you all very much for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak with this group.